Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Over the next couple hours, we're going to cover lots of different topics. So even if you're not interested in the one we're talking about, just stay tuned, because we're going to get to one that probably will be of interest to you. Just a minute, we're going to look at some of the issue of immigration. Right now, the latest surveys show that if there's anything that indeed Congress needs to do, it is the American people want some action having to do with health care and the cost of health care. So what do we have all the people talking about right now? Immigration. Oh, yeah. So far down the list, it's hard. But there is a reason, and I'll explain in just a minute, while that will be front and center. And that has to do with what is developing at our southern border because of what developed on the southern border of Mexico. Individuals coming from those other Latin American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and many others, that are prepared to make their way in a caravan, almost an invasion into the southern part of the United States, and what that's going to mean in terms of our news and information over the next couple of weeks. Do want to talk a little bit about this logjam in Congress right now, and a suggestion from someone at Empower Texas that says there are some really simple answers to that. Of course, we've also posted an article about the Second Amendment. John Paul Stevens, who is the former Supreme Court Justice, argues that we should repeal the Second Amendment for reasons that I think are fallacious. We're going to talk about that. And George Will has written a piece about paid family leave. The families will get the leave, and the children who are actually being taken care of will have to foot the bill. So we'll get into that. If we have time, also some studies coming out now on the fact that about 75% of these school shooters, while we're talking about Second Amendment stuff, are actually from not just broken homes, but incredibly broken homes where there has been infidelity, substance abuse, criminal behavior, domestic violence, child abuse, in addition, of course, things like divorce and separation. So we have a lot to cover, and that's just, of course, in the first hour. Second hour, we're going to be talking about the Syrian refugees. We'll spend some time in the third hour, which you will not be able to hear on this particular radio station, but you can certainly watch online or listen online, where we'll look at the issue of whether or not Facebook and Twitter and YouTube should be regulated, and then finally talking a little bit about how to prepare those young people for college with a new study that has come out as well. So lots to cover today, but let me, again, focus on this issue of immigration. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, because I fear we're going to be spending a lot of time in the next couple of days or weeks about it, because as this particular article points out, in case you've missed it, there's an interesting situation brewing on the southern border where an increasingly hostile Mexico seems to be assisting a direct attack on U.S. sovereignty. This comes from an article that appeared, interestingly enough, in Red State, and it has to do with this ongoing study that has been documented about the number of individuals who are crossing from Central America into Mexico, which itself is hard to imagine because Mexico has even more stringent border controls than the United States in many ways, but they're sort of being allowed to come through, and this is why you've seen some of these tweets from President Trump about the fact that Mexico is doing very little, if not nothing, at stopping people from flowing into Mexico through their southern border and then into the United States. And he says they laugh at our dumb immigration laws. They must stop the big drug and people flows, or I will stop their cash cow, NAFTA, we need a wall, and of course, you know, on and on, all the things that he's been saying. But now for about 5 days from this report, which is now a couple days old, hundreds of Central Americans, children, women, and men, most of them from Honduras, have crossed the immigration checkpoints, military bases, and police in a desperate, sometimes chaotic march towards the United States. Despite their being in Mexico without any authorization, no one has made any effort to stop them. It's organized by a group called Pueblos Sin Fronteras, or People Without Borders, and the caravan is basically moving now across Mexico to our southern border. And it says in this article, when they get to the United States, they hope American authorities will grant them asylum, or for some be absent when they attempt to cross the border illegally. More likely it is that they will set up an enormous challenge to the Trump administration's immigration policies and its ability to deal with an organized group of migrants numbering in, this one says hundreds. Some people say the group is now at least 1,000. There was one group that they counted 1,200 just on the first day. So I think 1,000 is too low. 5,000 may be too high, but it's in that range of thousands that are planning to actually go across the border. Now, the argument is that they're defying the Trump administration. But I love what this particular article says. Actually, they aren't defying anything. Mexico has the ability to turn these people back. The fact that they didn't, and they are allowing them to proceed on the march, tells you all you need to know about the game that is being played right here. So just a little bit of a understanding that we're going to be hearing a lot more about immigration, one, because of this, if you will, invasion, or caravan as it's called. But number two, because it has become also very controversial now that the Trump administration has decided that they're going to ask whether or not you're a citizen on the next census, which, of course, comes out in 2 years. And this one from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration has decided to include a question about citizenship in the 2020 census, and Democrats are calling it an attempt to rig the count. They say that's unlikely, and it ignores the real problem, which is that the White House is continuing the Obama administration's practice of politically weaponizing the Voter Rights Act. What they're saying is that when you ask those questions about race and gender and a variety of other things, some of which are asked routinely, of course, in the census, because we want to know that, some which are asked even more significantly in what's called the American Community Survey. They ask not only citizenship status, country of origin, and a variety of others, but a lot of that then is used as the data to reapportion House seats and also to dole out federal grants and the rest. Now, the argument from the Democrats is they claim the citizenship question, now I'm reading again from the Wall Street Journal, will depress response rates by undocumented immigrants and that the left-leaning state population will be underestimated. But if you look at the 2000 long form, which did ask citizenship, the only people that declined were a very, very small percentage indeed. So when we actually had that question on a long form, which not everybody fills out, didn't have that many people decline. But even if it is an undercount, it would affect Republican states as well. Consider the fact that undocumented immigrants make up 10% of Yuma, Arizona, 10% of McAllen, Texas, 10% of Gainesville, Georgia, 7% of Miami, to mention just a few. And when you look at places like Los Angeles, 7%, New York, 5%, Chicago, 4%, in some respects, the Republican states might be affected as well. But nevertheless, we're going to have this ongoing controversy about immigration, I predict, over the next couple of weeks. One, because this caravan, dare I use the word invasion, from Honduras and other countries south of Mexico will be crossing our border or attempting to cross our border. Number two, of course, the ongoing debate about whether or not to ask someone on the census if they're a citizen of the United States. So if you have thoughts about that or questions about it, I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. But when we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues that you need to know about. One of those is, why is it taking so long to just get anybody in a position in the Trump administration? I think you know why, but we'll explain more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The ongoing debate about how to stem the problem of gun violence in America has often been fueled by inaccurate statistics and faulty conclusions. If we are to craft effective public policy concerning gun violence, we should insist that accurate facts and figures be available to citizens and legislators. First, let's at least acknowledge that violent crime has been dropping for decades. Lots of recent media attention make it seem like violence is on the upswing. It is not. For example, the homicide rate in 2011 was almost half the rate in 1991. The gun-related death rate in 2013 was half of the rate in 1993. Of course, we still hear and read about how dangerous various places in America are. That is true because most of the murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked either to gang or drug activity. Second, a very high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In every year, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. Third, most murders and other shootings are done with handguns, not rifles. The FBI Uniform Crime Report shows that gun-related homicides are done with handguns, and rifles account for less than 3% of gun-related homicides. Fourth, often we can predict what sort of person who will commit a murder or a mass shooting. Significant percentages of men who commit murder are in a gang or using drugs or an abuser in a troubled relationship. A high percentage of mass shooters have extensive histories of mental illness. These facts and many others need to be included in our debate about gun violence in America. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of the articles we're talking about today you can find on our website, pointofview.net. If not, you certainly can do a Google search to find some of the others. But one of those that I thought was so interesting, and I think a source of very significant frustration by the Trump administration, is one we mentioned a minute ago, the lack of cooperation from Mexico. But another one is just the inability to get your people in office. I mean, let's understand that we're now talking about April 2018. Donald Trump came in as president in January 2017, and there are a number of empty seats. Deborah Saunders, who is a columnist actually for the San Francisco Chronicle, said that even though President Donald Trump fired Secretary of State Rex Tillerson 2 weeks ago and nominated CIA Director Mike Pompeo to replace him, even if a speedy confirmation puts Pompeo in charge of Foggy Bottom, which is the name they're giving for the place where the State Department is located, in short order, he'll end up as the boss of a lot of empty seats. The American Foreign Service Association lists 188 ambassadorial positions, but fewer than 75 out of 188 have been filled. The administration has failed to name individuals to fill the usual ambassador positions, except for the number in the high 30s. So part of it, okay, goes to the Trump administration not naming ambassadors. But the rest of the problem has to do with Democratic attempts to slow the process down to a complete crawl. The press secretary, Sarah Sanders, the other day said a stunning 43% of the president's highly qualified nominees are still waiting for confirmation in the Senate.
And this is due, of course, to the tactics being used by the minority leader, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, which he said tactics have led to 102 fewer confirmations than the next closest administration. So the argument that, well, this is typical for any incoming administration, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, no, it's not. It's not even close. Let's take one example that Deborah Saunders uses, who I think illustrates something that Kelly Shackelford has pointed out more on our Friday program that I had never really paid attention to until he did. And that is, even when you have nominees that have been put forward again by President Donald Trump, which were actually put forward by Barack Obama. So these are Barack Obama's nominees that didn't get acted on before. The Senate slows them down as well, which is really odd, but it's just slowing the whole process down. We don't even care who they are. And one of those individuals, which I think is a good illustration of that, is Richard Grenell. Now, he, by the way, is a homosexual, has supported the gay rights issues, and is a perfect nominee for the Democrats. I mean, the kind of person that they would want to actually serve as an ambassador to Germany. He is qualified. He has been a spokesperson for 4 U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations. So in terms of experience, in terms of his sexual orientation, this is the kind of individual that you would think that even the Democrats would say, well, we might slow up some of these individuals, but gosh, we like this guy. This is the kind of person that Barack Obama would have put in office. He, of course, also, this is where maybe he gets the ding, served as a national security spokesperson for, at that time, candidate Mitt Romney in 2012. But he's openly homosexual spokesperson. As a matter of fact, he actually had resigned from that post because some of the social conservatives were not pleased with some of the positions that he held. But what's happened to this individual? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee advanced Grenell out in October. And so as a result, what we see here is a situation in which there was what is called a hold. Now, most holds are public, but this one was secret. And so, again, Deborah Saunders says it wasn't until March 22nd when Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell asked the Senate to approve a floor vote on Grenell that a name presented itself. And the person complaining about this individual was Jeff Merkel. And Jeff Merkel, interestingly enough, blocked the vote. Now, he's a Democrat from Oregon. And under the cloture votes, then, one objection can delay a confirmation vote until 30 hours of debate. And those 30 hours of debate mean real work doesn't get anything done. You might say, well, why in the world did he object to the lengthy to this? Well, it was, quote, due to the lengthy track record of tweets attacking both prominent Democrat and prominent Republican women, which I don't really understand what he did that was so critical. But nevertheless, if he had said something negative about Hillary Clinton, maybe that was enough. And so that kind of brings us to, well, what's the solution? And Michael Quinn Sullivan, writing in Empower, Texas, points out that there is a real simple solution, and it's Rule 22 in the United States Senate. But it so happens that the Senate, at least the Senate Republicans, aren't actually following the rule. He says, despite being the senior senator from Texas, John Cornyn has been unwilling to stand tough for Republican priorities in the face of opposition from the Democrats. This was on full display in the recent spending bill debacle. Just as bad has been his unwillingness to enforce Senate rules to gain confirmation of President Trump's nominees for important executive branch offices. So, what is Rule 22, you might ask? Well, Rule 22 actually is a situation in which if there is an objection, as we've pointed out before, then you go into 30 hours of debate. Now, sometimes Congress has been willing to go into that debate, but most of the time they don't. And so here is where, again, the Republican leadership, if they really want to exercise it, can begin to move forward. Because, again, Michael Quinn Sullivan says that today Rule 22 of the Senate is being violated because Cornyn and many of his colleagues refuse to fight for Trump's nominees.
Senator Ted Cruz has publicly stated he supports fighting the Democrats, but as often the case, Cornyn refused to stand with him. Senate Rule 22 allows for 30 hours of debate per nominee pending before a Senate for confirmation. The rules clearly state that each senator can only debate each nomination for 1 hour at a time and no more than 2 hours total, up to a grand total of 30 hours per nominee. But he says instead the Senate Republican leadership is simply delaying the votes when Democrats express their intent to talk. Yet Democrats are not being forced to talk. The Republican leadership is refusing to enforce Rule 22. Bluntly, Chuck Schumer is deciding when President Trump's nominees are confirmed by the Senate because Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his sidekick, Majority Whip John Cornyn, are too busy co-chairing the risk-adverse subcommittee of the Comfortable Caucus, as he calls it. And then rather than play footsies with the Democrats, Cornyn and McConnell, he says, should man up and enforce the Senate rules. Make Schumer and the Democrats line up and debate each nominee's merits, put the Democrats' obstructionist resolve to the test and on full display. Cornyn will tell us that the Senate Majority Leader schedules the Senate floor, not him, and that's true, but as previously noted, Cornyn is doing nothing to change the status quo, and it appears that while he wants the trappings of power and to be in the room where powerful decisions are made, he doesn't have the responsibility that comes with it. So the solution to that, without getting into all the other comments by Michael Quinn Sullivan, is simply to say, okay, 30 hours of debate, go. Here's the stopwatch. How many of those Democrats are going to stand up or are there for 30 hours and talk? We know they're not. And we know that if they do, it will be front and center for all sorts of campaigns and even C-SPAN videos and all of the rest, and say, okay, you know, when we hear about these filibusters, they aren't really filibusters. You know, they're not like you heard in the old days where you stand up and read for hours. This attempt to say, well, we're going to have 30 hours debate, they're not going to be up there for 30 hours to debate some of these individuals, especially if, indeed, when they start talking, they stray very quickly. And that's when the parliamentarian, again, instructed by Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn and others, can say, you're off topic. You can't read from the phone book. You can't read from the children's book, which, by the way, Ted Cruz did one time. You have to stay germane to the topic, and that is, we want to know why you actually do not want a vote up or down on Richard Grenell for ambassador to Germany. We want to know why you don't want to have an up or down vote on some of these individuals that have been appointed to the Federal Appeals Court. And I think as soon as you start forcing the Democrats to actually stand in the well of that Senate and actually talk, they're not going to talk for 30 hours, but even talk for an hour, they're going to say, okay, we give up, we'll have a vote, and then we'll begin to move things forward. So the game is being played on the other side by the Democrats. You know so well that if the role were reversed and the Republicans started doing that, which they don't, but if they did, the Democrats would call their bluff. What I think is time for the Republicans to do is to call the bluff of the Democrats and to say, we have all of these positions, 188 ambassadorial positions, and fewer than 75 of them have been filled. We have almost 100 different open positions in the federal judiciary in terms of the appeals court and the district courts. It's time to get on with putting qualified men and women in those positions. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the other topics I wanted to address is the issue of the Second Amendment. And the reason for that is last week you had the retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens write an op-ed in the New York Times advocating for the repeal of the Second Amendment. Now, that's been a position that has been advocated for some time by a number of liberal or progressive pundits and activists, something they've been working towards for some time. And so whether or not that is even feasible, and it was interesting to see the reaction both from liberals and conservatives. Liberals saying, don't talk about that, Justice Stevens. You're just giving fodder to the gun rights advocates and the supporters of the Second Amendment, because now they can say, see, they really do want to take away our Second Amendment rights. And it's been criticized by the conservatives as well as something that's not really going to happen. But there was something that was missing, and I thought it was kind of worth taking just a few minutes to talk about that. And what was missing is some of the historical revisionism of the justice. And there are some articles that have been posted. I'm going to do a commentary on it for next week that will come out. But I thought it would be worthwhile to at least go into a little of that. And again, we have posted one of our articles here today from the stream of all people, although I could also point you to some others. David Harsanyi in National Review did a very good piece as well. But this one by Amy Swearer is really very well done, because she points out that he insists that even though he was the dissenting opinion in the Heller case, District of Columbia versus Heller, that his position and his view is correct. Well, I would understand that. He claims that for over 200 years after the adoption of the Second Amendment, it was uniformly understood as not placing any limits on either federal or state authority to enact gun control legislation. He also criticizes the National Rifle Association, as does every liberal or progressive these days, and says that they are the one that came up with this theory of an individual right to keep and bear arms. And, of course, then he demands the elimination of the Second Amendment. Well, Amy Swearer does a very good job of taking this apart in three ways. Way number one is to say that the framers, not the NRA, first articulated the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right. And before we get into that, I'm a simple man. We can get into all the legalese and everything like that, but it's just pretty simple. The First Amendment, is that an individual right, or is that a right for a group? Well, your individual right to freedom, what? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, not establishment of religion, free exercise of religion, that's individual. I mean, some, of course, freedom of the press is more a group, but still you have that freedom as well. The Fourth Amendment, let's look at that one for just a minute. That one talks about you have an individual right to not have individuals intrude in your life. This whole issue of investigation, and you have to get a warrant and all that. That all is to protect what? An individual right. The Third Amendment is a little harder to get at, but again, it's an individual right to not have military quartered in your home, something we really don't have much concern about now. So if the First, the Third, and the Fourth Amendments all have to do with individual right, doesn't make sense that the individual right would also apply to the Second Amendment, since almost all of these, going all the way down, and those first couple of amendments all are about what? Individual rights. But let's not just use that common sense understanding. She goes on to say, while it is true that the founding generation mistrusted standing armies, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists maintained basic implied assumptions throughout their disagreement over the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, including the understanding that the new Constitution gave the federal government no authority to disarm the citizenry. Don't believe it? Okay, pick up a copy of the Federalist Paper. Go to Federalist Paper number 46. That was written by James Madison. Okay, who's James Madison? He's known as the architect of the Constitution. He's the individual that was at the Constitutional Convention. He is the one that pushed through the Bill of Rights. I think he'd have a pretty good idea of what they intended. Federalist Paper number 46 says, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier more insurmountable than any other simple government or any form can admit. So the first thing it shows is that we don't allow governments to remove any of that. And, of course, if you want to take another, if you will, founder, how about Samuel Adams? I think most people would say Samuel Adams was one of the founders, certainly one of those feisty individuals who was part of the American Revolution, and at the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention declared the Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms.
individual right. I could quote some more. She has some quotes from Noah Webster and a variety of others, but let me move on to my second one. First point is the framers are the ones that articulated the Second Amendment as an individual right, not the National Rifle Association. Number two, the existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms is apparent throughout the nation's history. Again, that was one of the arguments made by Justice John Paul Stevens. And yet, again, she gives some good quotes. I'm only going to give you a couple. One, George Tucker in the American edition of Blackstone's Commentaries. Now, what are those? Well, William Blackstone wrote commentaries on the English law, and when those commentaries came here, those were used in many ways to train lawyers. How did Abraham Lincoln become a lawyer? He went through and read the Blackstone's commentaries, passed the bar. Well, again, Blackstone's commentaries, the edition there by George Tucker, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and this without any qualification as to their condition or degree, as is the case of the British government. William Rawle, in a treatise on the view of the Constitution of the United States of America, wrote this concerning the Second Amendment, quote, no clause in the Constitution could by any rule of construction be conceived to give Congress a power to disarm the people. Such a flagitious attempt could only be made under some general pretense by a state legislature, but if by any blind pursuit of inordinate power either should attempt it, this amendment be appealed to as restraint on both. Really, a direct attempt to say states could not prevent that. And, of course, perhaps the most famous quote, one that I've heard used so often, Joseph Story was a Supreme Court justice, and, of course, in his commentaries on the Constitution, actually said the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers, and will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them. So again, you've got all sorts of things that the framers articulated. Second Amendment as an individual right, the existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms, apparent throughout history. Number three, real quickly, her point, the Heller decision, had absolutely no negative effect on the safety of the students in various countries, and even in this particular country or in those schools as well. Because she says this perhaps is the most disappointing assertion of Stevens' op-ed, because it is an objective, quantifiable fact that America's school children are safer today than they have been over the 3 decades, even while the number of legally owned guns per capita has increased. She says since the early 1990s, the number of students killed on school campuses has plummeted by 75%. The percentage of high school students carrying weapons to school dropped from 14% in 1993 to 4% in 2014, and the percentage of students reporting easy access to a loaded firearm at home similarly decreased. The number of shooting incidents involving students also has steadily declined. Now, Ben, I will be the first to admit that even one death is a horrible statistic, but the reality is, if you look at my commentary today, in which I pulled together some of these facts and figures on gun violence, we can see that violent crime has dropped precipitously over the last couple of decades. We can see that the high percentage of gun deaths that we do have reported are due to suicides. Matter of fact, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention every year publish data on gun deaths, and every year gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, in some cases by as much as 2 to 1, 2/3 to 1/3. And then when we talk about murders, most of those are done with handguns, not rifles. Only about 3% of all gun-related homicides are done by rifles, which is, of course, what is the attempt to ban right now. And, of course, we also, as we can talk about sometime in the future, also can, in many cases, predict the kind of person who might commit a murder or a mass shooting. A significant number of those murders are gang-related, drug-related, or in some cases tied to an abuser of a troubled relationship. And a high percentage of mass shooters have extensive histories of mental illness. And a commentary I have coming out next Monday, I guess it's coming out next Tuesday, actually goes into the details about how so many of them have come from difficult family situations. Some of them have been using certain kind of prescription drugs. And, of course, we've had just the incredible decline of traditional Christian values. So you can come up with some pretty good explanations for those.
But nevertheless, if you'd like to read the entire piece, it is available at our website, pointofview.net. And again, take the time to read some of these, photocopy them, pass them around, hit the share button, put them on your Facebook page, get a conversation going. That's what we're trying to provide you with here at Point of View. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lessons about religious liberty come in some of the most remarkable stories. For instance, a Pennsylvania town recently required its Amish citizens to hook into its public sewer system. Frankly, I never thought this would pose much of a concern, let alone a question of religious liberty, but I was wrong. It turns out the sewer system utilizes an electric pump. The Amish, for religious reasons, are not permitted to enjoy the modern conveniences of electricity. So even though their outhouse is of the traditional non-electric kind, the electrical pump of the public sewer taints the Amish privy. In fact, according to the documents filed with the court, the Amish family could be excommunicated from their religious community if they were to totally connect. Now, this is a fascinating question. Clearly, the state has a compelling interest in ensuring the proper containment and flow of sewage, but is such an interest compelling enough to overcome the substantial burden hooking into such a system would place upon the religious liberty of the Amish? It's a tough question, but I'm thankful we live in a country that pauses to consider the impact something like a sewer pump might have upon the religious liberty of its citizens. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Our national motto, "In God We Trust," is under attack. Radicals want it off police cars, money, and more. Support our national motto by going to firstliberty.org/decal to ask for your attractive In God We Trust window cling from First Liberty. Help more Americans remember that God is the foundation for America. Request your free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org/decal. Show them where you stand. That's firstliberty.org/decal.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, the next hour we're going to be talking about Syrian refugees. A little bit later in the third hour, we'll get into whether or not we should have government regulate Facebook and Twitter and MySpace, so probably not even important anymore, YouTube and some of those, as well as looking at the transition from high school to college. So just a lot to cover, as we always try to do here on Point of View, and give you a perspective that maybe you don't hear in other venues. One that you might run into is the whole question of paid maternity leave. I love how George Will kind of put it, that ultimately you get to have maternity leave, your baby gets the bill. And it's kind of intriguing here. George Wills starts out, and we've posted this article on our website as well if you'd like to read it. He says the recent bipartisan budget agreement, which signals that 12-digit deficits are acceptable to both parties. There's a problem right there. When Republicans and Democrats say, well, you know, that's just kind of what we have to put up with in terms of keeping the government running, 12-digit deficits are acceptable to both parties when the economy is robust, indicates a government's future. So, government's pregnancy, which was announced 9 months ago by a tweet from Senator Marco Rubio. In America, no family should be forced to put off having children due to economic insecurity. I love the phrase, and Judge Will does it as well. The phrase due to economic insecurity is a way of avoid saying until they can afford them. Evidently, it is now retrograde to expect family planning to involve families making plans that fit their resources, which brings us to, he says, the approaching birth of a new entitlement, paid family leave after a birth or adoption of a child. This arrival will coincide with gargantuan deficits produced primarily by existing entitlements. Still, he says that the president has promised to oppose. House Speakers Paul Ryan and his party's proclaimed determination to address the entitlement crisis, and the president has endorsed paid family leave. 5 states and the district and many other cities have paid leave laws, and at least 23 states are considering them. Naturally, given the nature of Democratic politics, the national government's portion of the political class is eager to truncate states' experiments by making paid leave either an explicit national entitlement or an implicit one by making states toe lines drawn in Washington. His point is well taken. Why don't we keep this experiment going in some states, in some cities, and see whether it works? These are oftentimes referred to, and has been referred to by President Reagan and others, as the laboratories of democracy. I can tell you without even looking at the experiment what it's going to mean. You're going to force more and more individuals in those cases. In some cases, they can be managers of small businesses or they can be major corporations to actually be forced to do that. And, of course, it's going to have, I think, a negative impact. First of all, on women. If you have 2 equally qualified individuals, a man and a woman who looks like she's probably going to have a child pretty soon, a man who's single, so let's make it more extreme, who are you going to hire? Well, unless you just really want to count by gender, you're going to hire the man, because down the road, you're not going to have to pay leave for him, especially if he's single, right? But even if he's married, probably not, although now they're more and more going to have this both for the men and the women. So in some respects, you can see how that would play itself out. And if somebody claimed gender discrimination, well, if you're both qualified, and maybe even the man is a little more qualified, but you like to have a woman, you'll take him, and you can prove in a court of law that he was more qualified. End of discussion. But in the back of your mind, you're saying, yes, and I didn't have to pay for maternity leave for her. Or maybe that's a policy that your company already has, but the government requires you to do it their way rather than the way you had planned. And so, again, you can see some of the problems. Well, nevertheless, George Will says that paid family leave is another predictable click of government's leftward moving ratchet. 25 years ago, Washington made many workers eligible for 12 weeks of unpaid leave, but all but guaranteeing that many and the absence of pay would come to seem as retrograde. The current administration speaks of 6 weeks of paid leave. Democrats fancy 12, a likely compromise of 18. And as Penna Dexter will be talking about with us on Friday, I got a chance to get her advanced commentary here as well. She points out some of the problems. And first of all, she says George Will originally titled his column, Paid Maternity Leave, Your Baby Will Get the Bill. Because ultimately what will happen is that somebody's going to have to be paying, and it's the next generation that gets to pay for all these unfunded liabilities. He writes, the debate will concern ways to disguise the benefits cost while requiring others to pay for it. She says one proposal is to pay for family leave through unemployment insurance. This would involve a new tax or an expanded payroll tax. Another idea is to allow new parents, moms and dads, to collect a few weeks of Social Security payments while agreeing to have that amount chopped off of what they get when they're eligible. That's pretty risky there as well. And so what happens, she said, to the expectation that someone in the household works so that the family can support this child? This is now retrograde, wonders George Will. So, again, nothing wrong with companies that want to provide that, but when you have the federal government mandating exactly when it has to happen, how long it has to happen, and how you pay for it, you lose a tremendous amount of freedom. Just before we take a break, let me just mention something that appeared the other day that just caught my eye. And, of course, we know that Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has really been taking slings and arrows from all sorts of people, upset about the fact that some of the data from Facebook has ended up elsewhere. But it's interesting, he did an interview the other day in which he said that the inspiration for Facebook came from Psalm 139. That completely caught me off guard, but that's what he said. When I read Psalm 139, 1-4, something just clicked. I saw a heavenly glow and heard the voices of angels, he concluded. Assuming angels sound like a hum of a billion servers and a heavenly glow looks like a backlit keyboard. But in case you haven't read Psalm 139, 1-4, a lot of us read verses 11 and following because that is certainly relevant to the idea of the sanctity of human life. But Psalm 134, 1-4 is, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. I know when you sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying low. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. So if nothing else, he is going to be, of course, testifying in front of Congress, talking about how Facebook is not a threat to privacy. But if nothing else, Psalm 134 says, even if other people don't know about what's going on in your life, Psalm 134 says God knows what's going on in your life. You searched me. Think of Facebook searches. You know when I sit and when I rise. Yeah, sometimes with some Facebook people, I know when they get up, when they go to bed, what they eat, whether they were at Starbucks that day, and a variety of other things. But nevertheless, that one completely caught me off guard. Psalm 139, the biblical justification for Facebook. And as we say around here so often, you cannot make this stuff up. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some really serious issues. What about the Syrian refugees? This has been in the news, and so we'll get a chance to talk with Vernon Brewer about that. Second hour after that, or the third hour of totally, would be one with Rachel Alexander talking about whether Facebook, we just talked about a minute ago, should be regulated along with Twitter and YouTube. And then we'll talk about, with Tim Elmore, the transition from home to college. So a lot to cover. And if you find yourself saying, wow, you covered a lot in 1 hour. Yes, we did. I'd like to read some of that. You can. All you have to do is go to the website, pointofview.net, and you can find those articles, some of which I am quoting that we did not post because we didn't want to wear you out, but certainly the ones on Second Amendment, on paid family leave are there, and the others are pretty easy to find as well. If you find yourself want to listen into it again, well, you can do that too. All you have to do is simply go to the website, pointofview.net, click on Listen. You can download a podcast, listen to it anytime you'd like. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.